Every morning, Tina leaves her house before it's light, when the city is still asleep. She walks down a deserted road, with 20 miles of work ahead of her. No buses, no rides, just her feet and the determination to be on time. Tina doesn't complain or tell anyone about her struggles. She knows that her work is important, and if she has to go, she will. It's her life. Officer Mark Jackson had been noticing her for several days while patrolling his area. He couldn't figure out why this woman walked so far and so early every day. There were no cars or people on the street, so he decided to follow her today. He follows her at a distance so as not to scare her. At first, he is simply curious, but gradually he begins to feel uneasy. She passes stops where buses do not go, through quiet residential areas, deep into industrial areas. The policeman decides to approach her and find out what is going on. What makes Tina walk this long path every day? What do you think might be behind this story? Write your thoughts in the comments and be sure to share where you are watching this video from. It's always interesting to know. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Thanks for watching, and enjoy! Tina woke up every day at 4 in the morning, so she could get ready and leave the house before the city came alive. Her path led through dark streets where the only sound was the echo of her own footsteps. Ahead were 20 miles to the small factory where she worked 12 hours a day. Her whole life was reduced to this walk, to a silent struggle against exhaustion and the cold that cut her face in the mornings. She was used to it, used to the fact that she could not count on transportation, because the bus routes had long been canceled in her area. She was used to being ignored, because she was one of those who were ignored. But something was wrong that day. For several days now, Tina had felt like someone was watching her. The faint movement of headlights in the distance, the muffled sound of an engine, she couldn't help but notice it. But there was no fear. There was only that quiet irritation that had been building up inside her for years. Tina knew there were too many of these things in her life, too many things she was forced to endure. She saw cars with white drivers drive by, their faces not even turning in her direction. They saw her, and at the same time, it was as if they didn't see her. It had become the norm. She wasn't surprised. Today, everything started as usual. Step by step, she covered the familiar route. In the darkness of the factory districts, she was surrounded by abandoned buildings, rusty fences. Silence reigned everywhere. Her legs had long since gotten used to the pain, to the fatigue, but she continued to walk, because she knew, if she did not come to work on time, someone else would take her place. Tina understood that she had no right to make a mistake. Mark Jackson was sitting in his patrol car at the time. For several days in a row, he had noticed her, alone and always on the same route. It was strange to see a woman walking so early and so far, especially in this weather. He couldn't understand what could have made her walk this distance every day. At first, he thought it was just curiosity, but then he began to feel uneasy. Her figure, flickering in the rays of the street lamps, seemed to him a symbol of something greater. Why was she walking alone, in this area, when all the normal people were already behind the wheel of their cars? He couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong here. Perhaps she was in trouble? He decided not to approach right away. He turned on the high beams and watched her from a distance, hoping that she would explain something with her behavior. But all he saw was a stubborn, heavy step that did not slow down. Minutes passed, and despite the cold morning air, Mark felt the tension growing. This woman walked as if she did not notice the world around her. Mark wondered what could have driven her to do this. Need, loneliness, fear. After following her for a few more blocks, he decides to stop the car and get out. The situation is too strange. Tina, noticing his footsteps behind her, did not speed up or slow down. She knew it could happen at any moment. There was no point in running or resisting. There were too many things in her life that she couldn't run away from, and, as it turned out, the patrolman was one of them. Mark stood still, watching her confident movements. He wanted to say something that would explain his presence, but his tongue wouldn't move. She walked as if she knew everything he was going to ask, and knew in advance that there would be nothing new in these words. Tina felt his gaze on her, but she didn't turn around. She knew that if she looked, she would see on his face what she had seen so many times before. It wasn't anger or outright hatred, but rather a mixture of bewilderment and pity that always lurked beneath curiosity. She hated that expression. She hated it because it said that her life, her journey, her struggles were incomprehensible and meaningless to those who had never lived the way she had. Tina kept walking. There were still many miles to go, And stopping meant being late. Being late meant more than just wasting work hours. It meant losing her chance to survive in a world that was already stacked against her. She felt the muscles in her legs cramping with fatigue, but she ignored it. The pain had become as familiar to her as the air she breathed. Mark couldn't stay away. He quickened his pace and in a moment was next to her. Tina only noticed his movement out of the corner of her eye, but she still didn't stop. He was young, about 35, with a face that had not yet erased the naivety characteristic of those who believe in the justice of the system into which they themselves were once immersed. He was one of those who did not understand that for some people justice is something ephemeral, inaccessible. Mark knew he needed to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about his life, his job. Being a police officer was his way of protecting people, of maintaining order, but now he felt powerless. What could he offer this woman? Ask her for a ride? Tell her her journey was too difficult and dangerous, as if she didn't already know that? They walked side by side, not exchanging a word, only their steps blending into one rhythm. And then Mark noticed, for the first time, he saw how tiredness showed through in her gait, how her shoulders were slightly lowered, but her back remained straight. There was something unshakable in her figure that made him remain silent. Not knowing how to approach this silence, he understood that before him stood not just a woman, but a whole story, a story that he might never know to the end. Mark remembered how, when he was young, his teachers had talked about equality, about equal opportunity for everyone. But now, working on patrol, he saw the world differently. Justice was not for everyone, and he realized that every day, his colleagues often talked about neighborhoods where, as they said, it was better not to walk. People like Tina were rarely talked about. Those who rose early to walk were ignored. To the system, they were invisible, like shadows flitting through the streets before dawn. Tina felt the policeman walking beside her. She saw no point in explaining. Nothing she could say would change the fact. This man, for all his intentions, could not understand what it was like to be her. He could empathize, but he would never be able to see the world through her eyes. He saw her as a victim, and she was not a victim. She was a fighter, and her fight was to get back up in that endless ring every day. Her weapons were patience and fortitude, and she knew that no one would help her through this. Mark continued to walk beside her, not knowing that his silence had already said everything that needed to be said. Tina didn't expect anything from him. She had long since stopped hoping for anyone's help, not because she was too proud, but because she knew that in this world, help only comes to those who look like them, who talk like them. She was different, and her story was different, and perhaps that was why she could never fully explain her life to anyone outside that circle. When the sun finally began to break through the gray morning sky, Tina allowed herself to slow down a little for the first time all morning. She was already close to the factory, to the place where she could forget about this journey for a few hours, immersing herself in work. Mark was still walking beside her. He wanted to say something, but he knew that any words now would sound stupid. As the first rays of sunlight began to break through the thick haze that blanketed the city, the tension between them became almost palpable. Tina, slowing her pace, heard Mark continuing to walk beside her, not retreating. This insistence of his was beginning to irritate. She knew she should just pass by, but his presence, this silent accompaniment, was like an unbearable shadow that would not go away. Her heart beat a steady, even rhythm, but something hot, inevitable was growing inside her. And suddenly, right in front of her, on the narrow street, familiar silhouettes appeared. Two men, in dark jackets, standing by the wall, as if they had been waiting for her. Tina froze for a moment, but then quickened her pace again, hoping that she would simply pass by. However, the men did not move. One of them, tall and stooped, took a step forward and looked at her with a smirk that was all too familiar to her. She had seen such looks before, a mixture of contempt and threat. Here, in these deserted places, no one would come to her aid. Mark noticed them at the same time as Tina. He tensed, his hand automatically going to his belt, to where his gun holster hung. But in that moment, he felt something more than just his duty as a police officer. It was a sense that he had to intervene, had to protect her, not because he was an officer, but because here was a person in danger. Tina tried not to show her anxiety, but the men moved closer, blocking her path. Her breathing quickened, though she remained outwardly calm. She knew Mark was there, knew his presence could make a difference, but she also knew that people like these two weren't afraid of the police. They even found it kind of fun. The men looked at each other and said something, but their words were lost in the thick of the streets. One of them spoke louder, addressing Tina, but the meaning of his words was clear without words. They wanted to put her in her place. She had encountered this many times. Somewhere deep in these men there was a conviction that people like her had no right to move freely, that she did not belong here, on their territory. To them, she was nothing more than an object for humiliation. Mark couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, placing himself between them and Tina, holding his hand out in warning. His voice was confident, but inside he was gripped by the same fear that was gripping Tina. The men stopped, their smirks gone, but the tension in the air didn't go away. One of them looked at Mark with a cold, indifferent gaze, as if assessing his strength. It all happened quickly. Tina instinctively took a step back, her mind buzzing, her legs refused to obey. This moment, this scene, had been repeated over and over in her life, like a vicious circle in which she always found herself at the bottom, always defenseless. But this time, something was different. This time, Mark was there. And then something clicked. One of the men made a sharp movement forward, and this became a signal for Mark. He instantly pulled his gun out of its holster and pointed it at the attacker, shouting something in his direction. At that moment, everything happened so quickly that Tina did not even have time to understand what exactly happened. The man froze, looking at the barrel of the gun pointed directly at him. The other stepped back, his face distorted with anger, but fear was not their driving force. It was something else, deep, dark, filled with hatred, directed not only at Mark, but at her as well. Mark was breathing hard, his heart pounding, but he didn't lower his weapon. He felt that if he did, the situation would spiral out of control. The men didn't look away, and then, as if by silent agreement, they began to back away slowly. Backing away, the silence was heavy on his ears. Even the wind had died down. As they disappeared into the shadows of the buildings, Mark stood there for a few seconds, still holding his gun at the ready. Tina watched him, feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She didn't know whether to feel gratitude or disappointment. This was her world, a world in which Mark was an accidental guest. And even though he had just saved her, she knew it wasn't the end. It was just another chapter in a long, painful story. Mark slowly lowered the gun and looked at Tina. He wanted to say something, but the words seemed to be stuck in his throat. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the men had stood. She didn't look scared, just tired, as if the scene that had played out that morning was just another routine in her life. Tina finally looked up at Mark. He could see the emotions mixed in her eyes, tiredness, pain, gratitude, but also something more that he couldn't quite place. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but he knew that question was pointless. Everything she experienced each morning was far beyond just okay. She didn't say a word and just continued on her way. Tina had settled into her rhythm again, her footsteps echoing on the deserted road, as if everything that had happened had been a brief interruption to her routine. Mark stood, watching her walk away toward the factory. His own heart was still pounding with stress, but he knew he couldn't just go back to patrolling and pretend nothing had happened. He had to learn more, figure out how to move forward. As Tina disappeared into the distance, Mark returned to his car, barely keeping it on the road. His legs were still shaking from the strain, but he knew he had to act. He couldn't just brush off what had happened. He had to find out who these men were and why they were after Tina. Mark headed towards the nearest precinct, where his colleagues had already begun their morning shift. His job was primarily to maintain order, but today's incident was more than just a challenge. It was something that required a deeper understanding. He knew he couldn't just leave Tina and her complicated fate outside of his work. When he arrived at the site, his colleagues were already gathered in the conference room. Mark told them what had happened. His colleagues listened attentively, but their reactions were cold and professional. They knew that for Mark this might be a personal story, but for them it was just another day at work. One of his colleagues suggested checking the CCTV footage from the area to identify the men. Mark nodded, knowing it might take some time. Questions were running through his head. Why had Tina ended up in this situation? Why were the men so confident in their impunity? And how had she managed to survive in this world where every day was a struggle? Meanwhile, Tina had reached the factory. She entered through the back door, as always, carefully closing it behind her. It was still dark inside, and only a few weak lamps illuminated the empty workshops. She went into the locker room, took off her warm but dirty clothes, and changed into her work uniform. Her hands were shaking from the remaining excitement, but she tried not to pay attention to it. She had too much work to dwell on emotions. When her shift began, she threw herself into her work. The clatter of the machines, the noise of the equipment, drowned out her thoughts. It was her way of escaping reality, of what was happening outside the factory. Here, she was one of many, and her work was valuable. In this world where she was unchanging, her work was her way of being noticed, a feeling that her efforts were not in vain. In the middle of the day, Mark met Tina again, but this time not on the street. He came to the factory under the guise of checking documents. The secretary could not refuse the policeman, and Mark entered the workshop where Tina worked. She noticed him immediately, but pretended not to see him. She did not want any conversations, especially with someone who could remind her of the stress she had experienced. Mark approached her, trying not to attract attention from those around him. He didn't know how to start a conversation, but he knew he couldn't leave her alone. He wasn't here to cause problems, he was here to help. And yet, the words caught in his throat when he saw her focused face, her steadfastness. Meanwhile, his colleagues were working on the CCTV footage. They discovered that the men who had been stalking Tina had criminal records. It turned out that they were connected to local gangs that controlled certain areas of the city. These were men who would not hesitate to intimidate those who could not fight back. This information only increased Mark's inner anxiety. Tina was at the center of something much bigger than he could have imagined. As time went on and the day drew to a close, Mark knew he had to act quickly to ensure her safety. He took every step he could to increase patrols in the area where Tina lived. His colleagues began preparing a report on criminal activity in the area to possibly increase security and prevent further attacks. Tina finished her shift and headed back to the same route. Dusk had fallen and the city was once again plunging into darkness. Mark spotted her again, just like he had in the early hours, but now he was prepared. He saw her covering the distance again, heading home. He was there, too, in the shadows, keeping an eye on her safety. As she passed the places where they had encountered the men earlier, Tina felt uneasy. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. The dusk was growing darker, and the shadows were becoming more ominous. Suddenly, she heard a rustling sound behind her and froze. Listening, her heart began to beat faster, and she quickened her pace again. At that moment, the same men emerged from around the corner, and Tina realized that they had not retreated. She felt the tension she had been trying to suppress bursting out. Mark, seeing the situation escalate again, took out his radio and transmitted a signal to the control center. He did not know what to do next, but he knew one thing: he could not allow Tina to face the same fear as she had this morning. The situation became critical. The men approached, and Tina, sensing the impending threat, slowed down, realizing that she would not be able to avoid a collision. Mark rushed forward. His car was already approaching. This time he was ready for anything, and he knew that he had to do everything to protect her. One of the men noticed the car and stopped. There was a mixture of anger and surprise in his eyes, as if he had just discovered that his plan had gotten out of hand. The others, seeing this, froze as well. Tina froze again, her hands shaking, her face even paler. Mark jumped out of the car and pointed the gun at the men again, but this time his voice was firm and decisive. He knew that this could be a decisive night, that the outcome of this confrontation would determine many things, not only for Tina, but for himself as well. Mark, who had jumped out of the car, stood at a distance, holding his gun at the ready. The men in front of him looked stunned and worried, but they did not retreat. There was not only contempt in their eyes, but also something far more dangerous, a sense of their own invulnerability. They clearly did not expect anyone to intervene and confront them. Tina, standing in the shadows and watching tensely, felt her fear turn into a steely determination. She knew that this moment could be decisive, and her actions could affect everything that happened next. She took a step back, keeping away from a possible confrontation. Mark began to speak, his voice stern and confident. He ordered the men to stand down and leave Tina alone. His words were short and clear, but the effect was immediate. The men, seeing his determination and the realization that the situation was out of control, began to back away slowly. One of them gave Mark an angry look, as if saying goodbye to the idea of continuing the conflict. Their steps were measured, but they radiated unrelenting aggression. As the men rounded the corner, Mark felt his tension ease a little. He turned to look at Tina, who was leaning against a street pole, trying to catch her breath. Her eyes were full of emotion, relief, fear, and gratitude. She couldn't say a word, but her gaze said more than any words could. Mark walked up to her, trying not to show how shaken he still was. He knew he had to make sure she was safe and help her get home, but his mind was still racing with thoughts of what to do next. They had to report what had happened, but right now it was more important that Tina got to her apartment safely. "We need to get away from here," he said, not demanding an answer but rather urging her to action. Tina nodded, but her body was tense, as if she still couldn't fully process what had happened. She began to walk, and Mark walked beside her, alert and watchful, watching for any new threats to emerge. As they walked, Tina glanced back from time to time, as if expecting the men to appear again. Mark noticed her hands shaking, and he knew that the fear she felt was deeper than just the fear of a few men. It was a fear built up over years of struggling and surviving in a world that was against her. As they approached her house, Tina stopped at the entrance and looked at Mark. She didn't know what to say. Her voice was stifled, and even if she could speak, words probably wouldn't have been able to convey everything she felt. "Thank you," she finally said. It was all she could say, but it was sincere and heartfelt. There was genuine gratitude in her voice, but also something more, an acknowledgement that someone had, however temporarily, stepped into her life to make it a little safer. Mark nodded. "I was just doing my job," he replied, though inside he knew that this moment was more important to him than just doing his job. He knew that Tina deserved more than just a moment's help. She was part of something bigger, and he wanted that understanding to be with him as he returned to his duties. As Mark walked back to his car, he couldn't help but think about Tina and her life. Everything he'd seen was just the tip of the iceberg. He knew her life was full of complexities that he couldn't fully understand, but he also knew that if he could take just one step toward changing her situation, it would be worth it. The next day, Mark went out to his station again, but his thoughts were on Tina and her difficult situation. He decided that he would keep an eye on her safety, but also try to figure out how to improve her conditions. He needed to do something to help her, and he was ready to act, despite the difficulties. Tina took to her usual route again, and although she tried to maintain her calm, her steps were a little more cautious. She knew that her struggle was not over yet, and that each day brought new challenges. But now, when she was out on the streets again, there was a feeling in her mind that maybe someone had actually noticed her and her difficulties, and this gave her new hope. The next few days were difficult for Tina, but her journey continued. She would leave the house again while it was still dark and walk the 20 miles to work. Although her body was tired, her spirit remained unbroken, but what happened that night left its mark on her life. Every step she took was more careful, and her intuition became even more alert. She felt that she could not allow herself to be vulnerable, but an inner unease would not leave her. Mark, on the other hand, continued his work, but thoughts of Tina kept him busy. He decided to take proactive steps to protect her. His colleagues began investigating, trying to find out more about the gangs that could pose a threat. Mark personally checked CCTV footage and contacted police sources to get any information that could help prevent further attacks. One day, when he saw Tina again on her way, he noticed that she looked even more tense than before. Her face reflected not only fatigue, but something else, anxiety that she was trying to hide. Mark decided that he could not just watch this. He had to do something more. He drove up to her in his car, offering to give her a ride to the factory. Tina hesitated at first, but then, feeling that this offer came from a person who really wanted to help, she agreed. She was silent inside the car, and Mark didn't try to break the silence either, understanding that the most important thing now was to make her feel safe. As he drove, Mark continued to think about how he could help her more effectively. He decided that he needed to not only keep her safe, but also try to change the situation that led to her struggle. This required an effort not only from him, but from the entire community, and he was ready to take on that responsibility. When they got to the factory, Tina thanked him and headed back to work. Mark watched her go, and his resolve grew stronger. He knew that continuing to do his job was good, but to make a real difference to her situation, he needed to join forces with others and find ways to help. In the following weeks, Mark met with several local organizations and social services to discuss how conditions could be improved for people in difficult situations like Tina. He also began working on programs that could offer more opportunities and support for those struggling with poverty and the threat of violence. Tina noticed a change in the atmosphere of the city. Although she had no precise information about what was happening, She felt that her life was starting to change for the better. There was a more positive mood on the streets, and there was a clear increase in attention to the problems of people like her. One day after work, as Tina was walking her usual route home, she noticed a group of people in front of her discussing the creation of a new community center that would offer help and support to people in difficult life situations. This center was initiated precisely in response to the problems that many people in her area were facing. Tina was amazed to see how her struggles could possibly inspire change. She felt like she was part of something bigger than just her personal struggles. Her journey was still difficult, but now it felt more valid, like someone was actually listening to her and understanding what needed to change. Mark continued his work, but now his motivation was even stronger. He knew that helping Tina was just part of a larger process of change that needed to reach the entire city. He also understood that his own role was not just to support, but to facilitate systemic change. Time passed, and the center that was talked about opened its doors. Tina was one of the first visitors, and she saw how many people came for help. The place became a symbol of hope and change. It offered resources, training, and support for those who needed help. For Mark, this was confirmation that change was possible. He continued his work, but now his efforts were directed toward maintaining and developing new initiatives. Tina, with her resilience and tenacity, became a symbol of the changes that had taken place in her life and the lives of others. Mark and Tina didn't talk often, but their paths crossed from time to time. Each encounter was a reminder of how important it was to take action to change the world for the better. Tina continued on her path, but it was a little easier now, and her struggles were not just her own, but part of a larger process that continued to move forward. Tina and Mark's story became part of the history of the city they lived in and a reminder that even one person who decides to act can change the lives of many. As time went on, Tina moved on with her life, but the changes that had begun in her environment were not permanent. Although the community center and support programs brought some hope, racism and discrimination were still a real part of her life. Invisible barriers continued to impact her daily experiences. Despite the positive changes in community support, the center that provided assistance became a place where Tina could find some support and understanding. Here she interacted with others who were going through similar difficulties, and together they looked for ways to improve their lives. However, when she went outside the center, she was again faced with the problem she had been struggling with all along. In a society where racism was deeply rooted, she often had to deal with prejudice. One day, Tina stopped at the local supermarket to buy groceries while heading home from work. She was feeling particularly tired and drained that day. At the supermarket, she encountered the usual service staff, who, while not overtly hostile, made no secret of their prejudice. When she approached the checkout, the cashier made no secret of her dislike, slowly ringing up the items and clearly getting annoyed. Tina knew that this was not the first time this had happened and most likely would not be the last. On the street, as Tina left the grocery store, her attention was drawn to a group of teenagers standing nearby. They were discussing something, and Tina felt their eyes on her. Although they did not say anything openly, she felt their judgmental gazes piercing her. Such moments were not uncommon for her, but each time they left a mark, like a reminder that her life was not an easy test. Mark, while continuing his efforts to improve the social situation in the city, also witnessed how racism continued to plague the community. He worked to create programs to raise awareness and educate on anti-racism, but he realized that these efforts were just the beginning. He saw racism manifest itself in many forms, from microscopic prejudices to outright discrimination. Mark often received messages about the difficulty people like Tina had in overcoming systemic barriers. One day after work, Mark met Tina at the community center. She seemed worried and quiet, which was not her usual behavior. Mark noticed her and approached her to ask if everything was okay. Tina told him about her recent ordeal at the supermarket and how she had once again been met with prejudice. Mark listened with empathy and understanding. He knew that the fight against racism did not end with programs and policies. It was a process that required a change in the minds of each individual. He promised Tina that his work would not stop, that he would continue to fight for change at the societal level, to create a space where people like Tina could feel safe and respected. Soon, Mark organized a series of community events focused on racism and discrimination. These events included roundtables, lectures, and discussions with local residents, experts, and activists. Tina decided to attend one of these events, hoping that her story and experience would help shed light on the issues she and others faced every day. When Tina took the stage to share her story, her voice was full of emotion. She spoke about how racism and discrimination had affected her life, how she had faced bias at work, on public transport, and in everyday situations. Her story was sincere and touching, and many in the audience felt that these issues were more widespread than they had imagined. Listening to her story, Mark and the other participants realized that much more needed to be done. Despite the efforts that had already been made, issues of racism and discrimination were still an integral part of society, but events like this helped push the boundaries of understanding and accelerate the process of change. After the event, Tina felt like she had taken a step forward. Even though her struggles were not over, she felt like her voice had been heard, and it gave her new hope. She knew that the fight was not over, and that there was more to be done to truly change societal norms. Mark continued his work, but now his efforts were focused not only on creating new programs, but also on increasing support for those fighting racism. He realized that it was important not only to talk about change, but also to actively take action to create a society where everyone has equal opportunities and where racism does not have a place. Tina and Mark continued on their separate paths, but their efforts were now united in the quest to create a more just world. Every step they took was part of a larger process that was just beginning, and though change was slow, they knew that every voice and every action was moving society closer to a more just future. After the event at the community center, Tina felt like her efforts to express her feelings and call for change had made a difference, but her daily life remained difficult and challenging. Each day, her difficulties only grew worse. Despite the public attention to racism, change did not come as quickly as she would have liked, and Tina continued to face real problems. One day, returning home after a particularly stressful day at work, Tina encountered another difficult situation. There had been an attack on one of the local stores in her area, and this event had caused active investigations by law enforcement agencies. Tina, returning with her purchases, found herself in the epicenter of the search. The police officers conducting the investigation began to suspiciously examine people in the area, and Tina, as always, came under suspicion. Even though she had nothing to do with the attack, the police officers immediately began questioning her and checking her documents when they saw her. Tina tried to explain her situation, but the officers were rude and showed no sympathy. They asked her strange and inappropriate questions, demanded that she provide proof of her identity, and their actions were clearly aimed at humiliating and intimidating her. One of the police officers even made comments that subtly referenced her race, creating additional tension. Tina felt completely helpless. Her fear and humiliation were growing, and she did not know how to cope with a situation that seemed completely unfair. Mark was furious when he learned of the incident. He knew that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger systemic racism that permeated society and the legal system. He immediately took steps to understand the situation and support Tina. He met with her lawyer and began investigating the incident to find out why her rights had been violated. Several weeks passed and Tina was still recovering from the stress she had experienced. Her financial situation became even more precarious as she had to miss several days of work due to her inability to function normally after the incident. She also faced negative attitudes from some of her neighbors who began to speculate about her connection to the incident. At the same time, despite the efforts of Mark and human rights activists, charges against the police officers were shelved and Tina's case received little media coverage. It was another reminder of how difficult it can be to break through a system that is often part of the problem. One evening, while walking home, Tina encountered aggression again, but this time it was more physically threatening. She noticed several men who had previously stalked her appearing in her neighborhood again. Their actions were clearly aimed at creating fear and unpleasant situations. Tina could not avoid them and, feeling threatened, tried to hide in a dark alley. The men, upon seeing her, began to threaten her and utter racial slurs. Tina tried to find a way out of the situation, but her fear only grew. At this point, Mark, having learned of the problems Tina was facing again, rushed to her aid without hesitation. He alerted other police officers and organized patrols in her area. This time, Mark and his colleagues intervened in a timely manner. They dispersed the men and helped Tina return home safely. While Mark was committed to continuing to fight for justice, He knew it would be a long and difficult fight. Tina's case was emblematic of a larger problem that many black women and people who experience discrimination face. He knew that only through a collaborative effort could real change be achieved. Tina, although safe, still faced the consequences of racism and systemic injustice. She continued her fight for greater dignity and support, knowing that her efforts, despite the difficulties, could be an example for others. Every time Tina went out on the streets, she faced new challenges, but each time she overcame a challenge, it became a step toward a broader understanding and fight against racism. Mark and Tina continued their efforts, recognizing that their work together was only the beginning of a long journey toward justice and equality. After that ominous evening when Tina faced threats from a group of men, her life became even more difficult. With mounting stress and constant fear, her daily routine became a real struggle. With each passing day, she sank deeper into a state of anxiety. Her nights were filled with nightmares, and her days were filled with constant caution and depression. Tina continued to work, but her efforts were met with new challenges. At work, her co-workers began to avoid her, influenced by the prejudices that were building up around her. As if her difficulties had become a reason for additional discontent, they began to whisper behind her back, and some even spoke out against her openly. This only increased her stress and feelings of isolation. In addition, her financial situation deteriorated rapidly. First, she had to miss several days of work due to the effects of the attack and the stress it caused. Then, unable to fully recover, Tina began receiving notices of debts and fines that accumulated due to late payments of bills. She tried to cope with the situation, but each step only added to her problems. One day, as Tina was walking home, her mood was particularly low. She felt that all her efforts to recover and overcome her problems were not working. She was again faced with aggression in her neighborhood. A group of teenagers who had repeatedly caused her trouble were now even more persistent. They began to chase her down the street, shouting insults and racist remarks. Tina, trying to remain calm, quickened her pace, but her heart was pounding with fear. When she finally got home, her mental state was at its limit. She locked herself in the apartment, but fear continued to torment her. The next day, her health deteriorated sharply. Tina began to feel severe chest pain and dizziness, which forced her to go to the hospital. The diagnosis was depressing. Stress and constant nervous tension led to serious cardiovascular problems. Doctors recommended immediate rest and treatment, but Tina's financial situation did not allow her to even pay the medical bills. Tina's condition continued to deteriorate, and she had to seek help from a social support center. But despite the resources provided, it was difficult to help her due to her financial problems and the need for long-term treatment. With each passing week, her life became more tragic. Mark, as he continued his efforts, also faced new challenges. His work to improve the social climate and combat racism became even more difficult. He recognized that attempts to create real change often encounter systemic barriers and resistance. While he continued to work on programs and events to raise awareness and support, reality often seemed beyond his reach. One day, when Mark visited Tina in the hospital, he saw her condition deteriorating. She lay in bed, exhausted and depressed. Mark was shocked by how many problems had accumulated on her shoulders, and he felt his own helplessness. His desire to help was great, but he knew that his work alone could not solve all the problems Tina was facing. At the hospital, Mark witnessed another tragic side of the situation. Tina was unable to receive proper treatment due to delays in financial assistance and a lack of resources. Mark also saw that racism permeated the healthcare system when one of the nurses, unaware of his presence, made several derogatory comments about Tina based on her race. Mark felt his work had become even more important. He realized that tackling racism and systemic inequalities required much deeper change than he had initially imagined. He began working on new initiatives to reform health and social care systems to prevent tragedies like Tina's. Tina, while continuing to fight for her health, was forced to face difficulties that seemed endless. Her life was full of fear and struggle, and despite Mark's efforts and the support of the community center, she felt that her problems were only getting worse. Night after night, her fears and pain became more and more unbearable, and even as Mark continued his efforts to support and create change, Tina's reality remained painful and hopeless. She felt her strength was running out, and all her efforts to improve the situation seemed futile. And so her tragic story continues. with each new day bringing new challenges and hardships as her and Mark's efforts to create change are met with deep-rooted systemic racism and insurmountable barriers. Tina continued to fight each new day, but her condition worsened. After she returned from the hospital, she had to return to her daily life. Despite recent medical problems and accumulated debts, her health remained fragile, and the constant stress only made her situation worse. In an attempt to maintain some normality, she began working again, but the physical and emotional strain began to affect her ability to perform her duties. One night, as Tina was returning home from work late, she was again threatened. This time, it was a new level of aggression. A group of men, who had apparently been following her, attacked her in a dark alley. Their violence was merciless. They beat her, leaving her with multiple injuries. Tina, having once again suffered horrific trauma, was taken to hospital with serious injuries, including broken bones and internal bleeding. Mark was shocked and appalled when he learned what had happened. He immediately visited Tina in the hospital, where he saw her in a critical state of illness. Tina was conscious, but her strength was waning, and the doctors were concerned about her condition. Mark felt that he had to do everything he could to change the situation and try to save her life, but he also knew that his options were limited. While Tina was fighting for her life, Mark also began to explore possible links between the attacks on her and wider issues of racism in society. He learned that many of Tina's attackers were linked to gangs that systematically abused people in her community. Mark, not wanting to ignore these issues, reached out to human rights organizations and began a campaign to draw attention to racist gangs and their activities. However, Tina's situation was becoming increasingly tragic. The treatment needed to restore her health required huge financial costs that her family could not afford. Despite Mark and community organizations' efforts to raise funds and help, the medical bills were piling up, and Tina found herself in an even greater financial crisis. Her family was having difficulty covering the costs of her treatment, and their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, Mark faced a new wave of obstacles. Local authorities who had previously supported his efforts began to turn their backs on the issue. In some cases, they even began pressuring activists and human rights defenders to stop their activities. Under pressure from various interests and systemic barriers, Tina's situation continued to deteriorate. Her condition remained critical, and each day brought new challenges. Doctors told her she needed a complex operation, which they were unable to perform due to a lack of funds. The news was a blow to everyone trying to help Tina, and another example of how systemic problems and racism lead to tragic consequences for individuals. That night, after another attempt at treatment, Tina suffered another seizure. Doctors and nurses worked to stabilize her, but every moment felt critical. Mark spent the night in the hospital, trying to find solace in his determination to do everything he could for Tina. He spoke with her family, helping them as best he could, and continued his work to highlight issues of racism and systemic injustice. Soon after, Tina underwent a complex operation, which was successful, but her recovery was long and difficult. Her physical and emotional state was seriously affected, and even after the operation, she needed a long rehabilitation. During this period, her life was filled with constant fear, pain, and hope for recovery. Mark continued his efforts to combat racism and create change, but his work became even more challenging as he saw how deep systemic issues were making change difficult. Despite his efforts, he realized that Tina's situation was just one of many stories that were going unheard and unaddressed. Tina and Mark continued on their paths, but each step was filled with difficulty and struggle. Their story continued to be tragic, and the changes they were trying to achieve remained elusive. Each new day brought new challenges, and their efforts to create justice and equality became more necessary, but also more difficult. After Tina underwent major surgery, her recovery was a difficult and slow process. Every day in the hospital was filled with new challenges and difficulties, but beyond her physical recovery, Tina continued to face deep systemic problems that made her life much more difficult. In the hospital where Tina spent much of her time, she encountered overt racism and bias from some nurses and doctors. In conversations she overheard, doctors would discuss her condition with derogatory remarks, unaware that she might hear them. Comments about her race, how some people are not able to cope, and how her social situation was not conducive to her health were a constant source of stress for Tina. Mark, still actively working to improve the social climate and combat racism, began to receive messages about how Tina's situation was only getting worse. He learned that it wasn't just healthcare that was a problem, but also how Tina was perceived in her own community. She faced bias not only from authorities, but also from members of her own community, which only added to her feelings of alienation and hopelessness. When Tina returned home after a long hospital stay, her problems only worsened. Her home, which had previously been her refuge, became a place of constant stress and anxiety. Violence in her neighborhood began to increase again. Some neighbors, prejudiced against her because of her race, began making open threats and intimidation. Her door was tagged with offensive graffiti, and her cars were vandalized. One day, when Tina was trying to go out to buy groceries, she encountered a group of teenagers who started a real bullying. They surrounded her, shouting racist insults and making threatening gestures. Tina tried to avoid the conflict, but their aggression only escalated. This incident became the last straw in her already challenging life. Mark, upon learning of what had happened, tried to draw attention to the incidents and increase protection for Tina. He organized meetings with local authorities and community organizations to ensure her safety and to try to change attitudes towards her in her own neighborhood. But his efforts were often met with indifference or resistance. Some local authorities, themselves part of a system that facilitated racism, offered only formal support but did not take real action to address the problem. Mark also faced an internal conflict. With each new incident and manifestation of racism, he became increasingly aware of how deeply rooted these problems were in society. He had to contend not only with the external manifestations of racism, but also with a systemic problem that made any attempt to create real change difficult. While Tina continued her recovery journey, she also had to face difficulties related to her financial situation. With medical debts and constant pressure from creditors, her financial situation remained critical. The organization of funds and assistance that had been provided to her previously could not fully cover her expenses, and her family continued to experience difficulties. Mark continued to raise awareness of racism and injustice, but he knew that each step forward required a great deal of effort and time. He organized rallies, wrote articles, and reached out to the media to highlight the issues faced by people like Tina. Despite his efforts, however, real change in public consciousness and systemic policy was slow. Tina, despite her determination and desire to recover, was in a state of constant stress. Her struggle for adequate treatment, financial stability, and protection from racist attacks became her daily reality. She continued to fight despite her internal and external difficulties, understanding that her personal story was only part of a larger fight against racism and systemic injustices. Each day was filled with new challenges and difficulties, but Tina and Mark continued their efforts to make a difference. They understood that their struggle was not only personal, but also part of a larger fight for justice and equality. And while change was slow, they remained a source of hope and a symbol of resilience in the face of deep-rooted racism and systemic injustice. Every morning for Tina began in the dark, before the city had even woken up. Her neighborhood, a combination of residential and industrial areas, was quiet, broken only by the occasional sounds of the city waking up. When Tina started her walk, her legs, accustomed to daily challenges, were once again climbing the difficult route, 20 kilometers one way. The first steps along the deserted streets were especially difficult. First, she had to walk several blocks to a wider road where the occasional car might appear. Then she passed half-empty public transportation stops that were not serviced at this early hour. With each step, she felt the cold seep through her clothes, forcing her to stir and quicken her pace. The entire way, Tina walked on asphalt, which was uneven and worn, causing her to stumble sometimes. In addition, frequent holes and potholes required constant attention and dexterity to avoid falls or injuries. The landscape beyond her home was bleak. Gray buildings, abandoned plots of land and the remains of old industry. These scenes made her journey seem endless. Despite the physical difficulties, the psychological pressure was no less severe. Tina often encountered racist attitudes and prejudiced attitudes. On her way, she encountered the occasional passerby or driver who looked at her solitude with suspicion. There were times when she was met with aggressive looks or unkind words that, due to their harshness, could have thrown her off track. With each kilometer, her legs became more and more tired, and the feeling of pain in her feet and knees became unbearable. Periodic rest stops helped, but did not relieve the main load. More often than not, despite the pain, Tina was forced to continue on her way, realizing that being late could lead to serious consequences at work. As she approached the industrial zone, her journey became even more difficult. Here, the roads were even less maintained, and the thick air, filled with the smell of exhaust fumes and chemicals, made it difficult to breathe. Workers who began their day in these areas passed by Tina, and again she felt the gazes of curiosity or disdain. Often, her path crossed paths that looked particularly depressing: old warehouses, dilapidated buildings, abandoned cars. These places reflected not only the physical difficulties of her journey, but also symbolized the social and economic barriers she had to face. By the time Tina got to work, her strength was running low, her legs were sore and tired, and her mind was worn out from constant stress and worry. As she worked, Tina constantly tried to ignore the discomfort and focus on her duties, but fatigue often made it difficult to concentrate and complete tasks. Each day, she returned home the same way, covering the same miles and facing the same difficulties again. In the evening, when she finally reached her home, her body was ready for rest, but her mind was exhausted. The evening was the time when she had to take care of herself and prepare for the next day. Despite physical fatigue and a constant feeling of pressure, it was a constant test of endurance, not only physical but also mental. So every day Tina walked her 20 kilometers. Despite the physical and emotional difficulties, her path was filled with a constant struggle with fatigue, pain and prejudice, but her determination and desire to provide stability for herself and her family were so strong that she continued to move forward despite all obstacles. Every morning, when Tina began her long journey, the first steps were especially difficult. In the dark, before dawn, when the city was still asleep, her feet began their journey across the asphalt, which was cold and uneven. At first, it was a warm-up of sorts, but after a while, every movement turned into a challenge. The cold air penetrated her bones, and as the pace increased, her body tensed in response to the physical exertion. With each kilometer she walked, her legs began to show signs of fatigue. Her feet ached from the constant pressure, and the discomfort turned into pain. The occasional chafing and calluses made themselves felt with each step. The soft tissues in her legs, without the necessary pads and support, became irritated and inflamed, which only worsened her condition. Tina often raised and lowered her legs, trying to relieve the pain, but it did little to help. At times, her legs, as if ignoring her desire to continue, began to give in. At such times, she was forced to slow down and stop for a short rest. During these moments, she would squat on the side of the road, taking off her shoes to give her feet some air and ease the pain. Even these short stops were excruciating, as each time she stood up again, her legs would experience a new searing pain. The difficulties increased when she crossed sections of the road with unevenness and potholes. Tina's legs were forced to constantly adapt to the changing conditions. Every stumble or wrong move in this case could lead to additional pain or even injury. Strong and sharp blows on hard sections of the road led to swelling and bruises, which she had to endure. When Tina walked through industrial areas, where the roads were even worse, her feet suffered from uneven surfaces and sharp stones. In these places, her steps became even slower and more careful. Dust and dirt got into her shoes, adding to the discomfort, and she had to shake them out and adjust her socks every time to avoid additional friction. Each return home was no less difficult. After a long day on her feet, and especially after 20 kilometers of walking, her legs were exhausted. The fatigue caused her muscles to spasm, causing severe cramps and pain. When she finally got home, every movement, even just moving around the apartment, was excruciating. In the evening, when Tina tried to relax, her legs, full of pain and fatigue, did not allow her to sit still. The swelling in her ankles became noticeable, and a constant feeling of heaviness reminded her of all the kilometers she had walked. She often spent time with her legs elevated to relieve the swelling and give them a chance to rest a little, but there was no complete relaxation. So every day was a challenge for Tina, where physical and mental stress intersected to create an unbearable burden. Her legs, suffering from pain and fatigue, were just part of a larger struggle she faced every day, trying to keep moving forward despite all the difficulties and obstacles. After Tina underwent surgery, her difficulties did not end. In the context of recovery, despite medical advice and regular checkups, she faced the same systemic barriers that had long plagued her. At the hospital where Tina spent her time recovering, racism manifested itself in unexpected ways. Every day, when she interacted with the medical staff, she had to deal not only with physical pain, but also with prejudice. Nurses and doctors sometimes talked among themselves about how some patients just don't appreciate care, and expressed frustration that Tina demanded additional resources when she was one of the most in need. These comments weren't just rude, they reflected deep racist attitudes that permeated not only their personal behavior, but the system as a whole. As she was recovering, Tina encountered more racism on public transport and in her neighborhood. Despite having long been forced to walk due to a lack of funds for transport, she was forced to take the occasional bus when possible. On these buses, she was again met with racist attitudes and prejudice. On one occasion, when Tina struggled to get on a bus, the driver ignored her and did not give her a seat. He also responded harshly to her request for help, insulting her in front of other passengers. Her neighborhood, when she returned home, was also full of prejudice and aggression. Neighbors who had previously shown at least a neutral attitude began to openly demonstrate their dissatisfaction. Tina often heard whispers behind her back, as someone said that some people are to blame for their own troubles or these people just don't deserve help. These remarks not only hurt her mentally, but also increased her feelings of isolation and alienation. One day, as Tina was walking home after a long day at work, she crossed paths with a group of locals who began to harass her. They shouted racial slurs, made threats, and provoked her. These teenagers were armed not only with verbal aggression, but also with physical abuse, such as throwing water at her and setting her bicycle, one of the few means of transportation available to her, on fire. This aggression was not simply cruel, it was part of a pattern of deep-seated racist behavior that permeated her life. Mark, hearing about such incidents, continued to fight the system and try to draw attention to the problems Tina faced. However, his efforts were often met with resistance and indifference. He found that local authorities, while willing to help, were not effective in practice. Some of the law enforcement officers he interacted with showed clear signs of racism and distrust of his efforts. This was a clear sign of how difficult it was to combat the systemic problems that were hampering any attempt to create real change. Mark organized rallies and raised awareness of Tina's problems, trying to highlight her situation and demonstrate how racism and systemic bias lead to real suffering. He worked with advocacy groups to increase pressure on governments and push for policy change, but each new effort ran into barriers that seemed insurmountable. Tina continued to experience racism in her daily life with each passing day. Her social environment and her own health became a constant source of stress. The severity of racist attacks and prejudice had such a profound effect on her mental state that it became difficult for her to remain optimistic and hopeful for a better future. So, despite the efforts of Mark and the human rights advocates, Tina's situation remained critical. Every day, her fight for justice and dignity was filled with new manifestations of racism and systemic injustice. Her story continued to evolve as a symbol of a larger struggle in which racism and bias led to real tragedy and suffering. Every morning, as Tina set out again, her body and mind were exhausted from the constant struggle. The physical pain was only part of her ordeal. The emotional toll of racism and systemic barriers was becoming increasingly difficult. One of these morning trials was an incident that occurred on a bus when her health was at its lowest ebb. Tina, still recovering from surgery, attempted to use the bus to shorten part of her journey. However, despite her obvious physical exhaustion and need for assistance, the driver refused to give her a seat, preferring to let another passenger, who was white, go first. When Tina tried to insist on her right, her request was rudely rejected and she was asked to stand up while other passengers watched the situation in silence. Many looked at her with disapproval, as if her simple demand for respect was infringing on their personal comfort. Mark, in an effort to help Tina and advance her cause, organized a series of community meetings and rallies to highlight her situation and the problem of racism in their city. However, even these efforts were often thwarted. He encountered local officials who demonstrated clear resistance to his initiatives. In one instance, when Mark attempted to present documentary evidence of racist attacks on Tina, officials turned away and did everything they could to ignore or minimize the problem. On other occasions, Mark received anonymous threats warning him to mind his own business, implying that his efforts could lead to serious consequences. As the situation became more intense, Tina and her family began to receive more threats and vandalism. Their home was set on fire at night and windows were broken. One day, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into their backyard, causing a small but painful fire. Despite constant reports to the police, the response from law enforcement was slow and ineffective. In some cases, the police not only failed to take action, but also demonstrated indifference to Tina's problems, leaving her even more vulnerable. Despite Mark's efforts, Tina's financial situation became critical. Her job, which she continued to do, was increasingly demanding of her physical and emotional strength, and her income did not cover even the family's basic needs. Medical bills and treatment expenses continued to mount, and the financial burden became increasingly unbearable. Every day Tina felt pressure from both her physical condition and systemic barriers that made her struggle even more difficult. She tried not to show her suffering to others, but every day was filled with fear and uncertainty. Every step she took was full of pain and fear, and every distance she covered was a feat. In his quest to create change, Mark not only continued to raise awareness, but also tried to organize support for Tina in the form of communities, foundations, and volunteer groups. He also worked with human rights organizations, which began to pressure local authorities and try to bring attention to her situation at a national level. But real help remained elusive. Tina's fight for justice and safety became emblematic of the larger problem of racism and systemic injustice. Every morning and evening, every step and every minute was filled with struggle and difficulty, and despite her efforts, her situation remained critical and required further action. Thus, Tina's life and her ongoing struggle became a constant reminder of how deeply rooted racism and bias can destroy lives and prevent real change from being created. Mark and Tina continued their efforts, but each day brought new challenges, leaving hope for a better future that seemed increasingly out of reach. After months of struggling with bias and systemic racism, Tina's life has undergone significant changes, many of which have had a catastrophic impact on her health and overall well-being. Despite her efforts, Tina continued to experience deep racism and injustice. This impact led to her physical and mental health deteriorating. She increasingly felt the effects of systemic racism, which manifested itself not only in aggression from others, but also in a disregard for her needs and rights. Health problems began to accumulate. The constant physical strain of her long daily walks led to chronic pain in her legs and joints. Tina suffered from constant inflammation and swelling, which made it difficult for her to move and often caused cramps and severe pain. The constant stress of racist attacks and prejudice weakened her immune system, making her more susceptible to infections and other illnesses. Her emotional state also became significantly worse. Constant pressure and threats led to Tina suffering from depression and anxiety disorders. The psychological trauma caused by the attacks and aggression did not give her peace, and she began to avoid social contacts, which aggravated her feelings of loneliness and alienation. Constant anxiety for her safety and for the future of her family made her life unbearably stressful. The medical care she received also did not help improve her condition. The biased attitude of some doctors and nurses continued to affect the quality of medical care. Medical errors, ignoring her complaints and rude treatment became part of her life. Sometimes her requests for help were delayed or ignored, which worsened her physical condition. Tina also faced severe financial difficulties. Due to chronic health conditions and unfair treatment at work, her income remained low, and her medical expenses and debts only increased. Her financial situation deteriorated to the point that she had difficulty covering even the basic needs of her family. As a result, her family was on the verge of financial collapse, which added even more stress to her life. In addition, her home, which had once been a refuge, had become a source of constant stress. Arson and vandalism, which had occurred due to racist sentiments, had left her home in poor condition. She was forced to repair it herself, which only added to the physical and financial burden. Despite these many challenges, Tina continued to fight. Her determination and resilience in the face of racism were inspiring, but her life was a real challenge. The constant struggle for safety, justice, and decent treatment was her daily reality. Mark, who continued to fight for change and bring attention to Tina's problems, felt increasingly powerless. Despite his best efforts, real change was slow and Tina's situation remained critical. His efforts led to some changes in public perception of racism, but these changes were not enough to fundamentally change Tina's life and improve her situation. Thus, Tina's life continued to be filled with daily trials and tribulations caused by deep-rooted racism and systemic injustice. Her health and living conditions worsened, and her struggle remained a powerful reminder of how difficult it is to overcome the barriers that stand in the way of justice and equality. In these circumstances, Tina found herself in a difficult situation where every day was a struggle for survival and dignity. Her physical and mental health was deteriorating, her family was suffering from the effects of bias and racism, and her attempts to find a way out of her difficult situation were met with numerous obstacles. Tina's life became a symbol of a larger struggle for equality and justice, with each of her trials highlighting the depth of the systemic injustice and bias that continued to ravage her life. After months of struggle and anguish, a spark of hope appeared in Tina's life. Things began to change thanks to several important events and efforts from both Tina and those around her. Mark, aware of the growing public outcry and support from human rights organizations, took decisive action to bring Tina's situation to the forefront. He organized a charity marathon and launched a fundraising campaign to help Tina and her family. These efforts attracted local media and public attention, which helped create a positive public response and accelerate the process of receiving help. Community support became more pronounced. People began volunteering to help Tina, offering medical services, legal assistance, and financial support. Local organizations and volunteers organized fundraisers to collect money for her treatment and home repairs. These donations helped cover some of her medical expenses and begin necessary repairs to her home, significantly improving her living conditions. On the political front, there were positive developments. Public and media pressure increased attention to the issue of racism and bias. Local authorities were forced to take active steps to correct the situation. Measures were taken to improve safety in the area. The number of police patrols was increased, and meetings were held with community representatives to discuss methods to combat racism and discrimination. In the health field, after intensive efforts to draw attention to Tina's problems, she managed to find a more reliable doctor who offered her adequate treatment and support. Specialists began working on her recovery, offering more comprehensive and effective treatments, which contributed to the improvement of her physical condition. Thanks to new medical programs and social assistance, Tina was able to access the necessary medications and therapies. Tina also began receiving psychological support, which played a key role in her emotional recovery. As part of a new psychological assistance program, she was given access to therapists and support groups who helped her cope with the effects of depression and anxiety disorders. Gradually, under the influence of professional help and the support of others, her psycho-emotional state began to improve. On the financial side, thanks to the funds raised and public support, Tina was able to pay off some of her debts and gain financial stability. Improved housing conditions and support from various organizations allowed her to focus on restoring her health and living a more stable life. Family dynamics also began to change for the better. Community support and new resources allowed her children to return to school without fear or stress. Schools began to take steps to provide a safe learning environment and prevent bullying. Tina and her family began to see positive changes in their environment, which contributed to their emotional and psychological recovery. Although Tina's path to full recovery was still far off, her life began to improve through collective efforts and persistence. Every day, she felt her physical and emotional well-being improve. The support she received became a symbol of the possibility of change, even when the situation seemed hopeless. Thus, Tina's life slowly began to recover. Overcoming racist barriers and systemic injustice became possible thanks to the combined efforts of the community, activists, and authorities. Tina, although still facing difficulties, now had a real opportunity to rebuild her life, finding hope and support in every step on the way to a better future. Over time and with the active support and efforts of various parties, Tina's situation continued to improve, becoming a story of true overcoming and recovery. After a successful fundraising campaign, Tina and her family were able to access specialized medical care that was previously unavailable. The new doctors who provided care not only alleviated her physical condition, but also helped her recover. Regular physical therapy sessions and specialized medical treatments began to bring real results. Tina gradually began to return to normal life. Her pain began to decrease, and she felt much better. Along with the medical care came help in rehabilitating her living conditions. The renovation work, funded by charities and local initiatives, was completed. Her home was not only restored, but also modernized. It now had new windows, a roof and heating systems, improving her comfort and safety. The interior renovation also included modernizing the kitchen and bathroom, which greatly improved the quality of her daily life. The financial support and assistance Tina received allowed her to pay off some of her debts and gain some financial stability. She began participating in a financial planning program that helped her manage her resources and budget effectively. This allowed Tina to feel less burdened by financial concerns and focus on her health and the well-being of her family. Her children's schools also began to work hard to improve their educational environments. New anti-discrimination programs and support for students who experience bias were introduced. As a result, Tina's children began to feel more confident and safe at school. Teachers and school staff received training on diversity and inclusion, which led to significant improvements in the educational process and social environment for her children. With her mental health improving, Tina began attending therapy sessions and support groups. These activities helped her cope with the effects of emotional trauma and overcome depression. As a result, her self-esteem and confidence began to recover, which had a positive impact on her overall well-being and relationships with her family. Mark, seeing the positive changes, continued his efforts to combat racism and bias, but now with even more passion. He began working to create a permanent fund for victims of racism and discrimination, providing support to others in similar situations. His work led to the creation of a new social movement that fought for justice and equality on a larger level. Tina also began to get involved in community events and activities to raise awareness about racism and discrimination. She shared her story to inspire others and help bring attention to the issues that many people face. This activism helped her find new meaning in life and used her experiences to create positive change in society. Over time, Tina was able to rebuild her life and find new opportunities. She returned to work, where she was treated with respect and understanding. Now that her health had improved and her financial situation had stabilized, she was able to look forward to the future with hope. Her road to recovery was not easy, but through community support, activist efforts, and personal resilience, she was able to transform her life. Tina, although she had faced challenges, was now determined to use her experiences to create a more just and inclusive society. Her story became an inspiration to many and a symbol of how, despite difficult challenges, one can overcome difficulties and make a difference. As time went by, Tina's life finally found the peace and stability she longed for. After months of struggle, effort, and community support, her situation improved significantly. Tina's health stabilized thanks to comprehensive medical care and regular physical therapy. The pain and swelling that had previously limited her daily life became less severe, allowing her to return to a more active life. Gradually, she was able to shorten her long walks and even began using transportation, making her daily commute easier. The financial stability achieved through fundraising and financial planning allowed Tina and her family to not only pay off some of their debts, but also save for the future. She was able to provide her children with the resources they needed and create a safer environment for her family. Psychological recovery also played a key role in her life. With the help of therapeutic support and groups, Tina dealt with the effects of emotional stress and learned to effectively manage her condition. Mark, through his persistence and tireless work, made significant progress in establishing a fund to help victims of racism and discrimination. His efforts led to improved human rights policies and increased funding for programs aimed at combating bias. Support from the public and authorities helped create a more inclusive society, where racism and discrimination began to be actively condemned and eradicated. Tina returned to work, where she was met with respect and support. She continued to share her story, speaking at community events and helping others who were facing similar challenges. She became an activist, working to change the system and create a more equitable society. Her struggles and achievements inspired many, and her example became a symbol of hope and resilience. Her children, who returned to school in a safe and supportive environment, began to actively participate in school activities and develop their talents. The improvement in their education and emotional well-being brought joy and satisfaction to Tina, who saw her children begin to achieve their goals and dreams. When Tina looked back on her journey, she felt proud and satisfied. Her struggles and overcoming of difficulties became a symbol of strength and determination. Tina's story ended on a note of hope and a new beginning, where the difficulties became part of her past and the future opened up with new opportunities and prospects. Tina's life, once steeped in the darkness of racism and strife, was now illuminated by the light of change and support. She was able to turn her tragedy into a source of strength and inspiration as she continued to work toward a more just and equal world. Tina, after years of struggle and overcoming difficulties, finally found peace and stability. Her life, full of challenges, was now filled with joy and meaning. Her health improved, financial stability allowed her to provide for her family, and psychological support helped her cope with the traumas of the past. Working to create an inclusive society, she inspired others with her story of resilience and strength. Tina's family life, lit with warmth and care, became a symbol of hope and new possibilities. The children, now supported and confident in the future, achieved their goals and began to build their own lives. Tina, returning to work and becoming an activist, continued to influence society, working to make racism and prejudice a thing of the past. Tina's story ended on a note of satisfaction and accomplishment. From her most difficult moments to finding peace and a new purpose, her journey became an example of fortitude and the possibility of change. Tina lived with the certainty that her struggles were not in vain, and that every step toward improvement was a step toward a more just world. We value your opinion and would like to know how you feel about this story. Have you or someone close to you faced similar difficulties in life? Your feelings and experiences can be an important part of the discussion and help others understand that they are not alone. Every opinion and story you share is important to us. It helps us create content that truly reflects reality and helps people. We appreciate your time and attention and hope this story was helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this story and want to support our channel, please subscribe to stay up to date with new stories and content. Your support helps us continue our work and share important topics. Also, if you have any ideas or suggestions on how to help other people or improve our stories, please leave a comment. Maybe your advice and help can make this world a little better.